This is Andrea Gregg, and you're listening to Death Talk Canada. Here at Death Talk, we're going to be discussing everything death. As a funeral director and embalmer, I'm surrounded by death every day. We will be discussing loss, grief, trauma, dying, palliative care, the MAID program, and the funeral industry. This is for anyone who's ever suffered loss, who lives with grief. My hope is to help you in some way by shining light on these difficult topics. Thank you for listening. Hello, Erica.
Hi,
Welcome to
Andrea.
Death
How are
Talk.
you? Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you being here today. And as I've said to you, I think a lot of people will find this episode very interesting because I think there's still a lot sort of unknown about the MAID program. Um, do you mind maybe starting just introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your work history?
Sure, sure. So I too feel that a lot of people are very much interested in MAID. We're certainly, in the beginning when MAID first came about in 2016, we were kind of whispering about it. But now we're talking about it, and a lot of people are talking about it. And I'll kind of reflect that throughout the interview. But so first, just let me say, I'm a nurse practitioner with Nova Scotia Health, and I'm also a member of CAMAP, which is Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers. The views that I express here today are strictly my own. It is not a reflection of Nova Scotia Health nor CAMAP. So for me, well, I graduated from nursing school a long, long time ago. And for the first 15 years of my career, I spent them in intensive care units. And whether that was an open heart ICU, a medical or surgical ICU, and then later on a neonatal ICU. So I've worked a really broad range of intensive care settings and situations. And then in 2007, I graduated from my master's program as a nurse practitioner. Started in family care and pretty much doing health from birth to death for the next 17 years. And then I knew that I wanted to be a part of MAID. And then when it came into inception and became law in 2016, I started right away participating in MAID. Mm-hmm. So this is my 8th year now within the MAID program, but I've been doing MAID full time since January of 2022.
Unbelievable. So you just knew right away authentically, right from the ground up, that you really wanted to be a part of this and sort of helped pioneer it really in Nova Scotia.
So a couple things about that, of course, working ICU for so long, I truly do feel that many times I've probably kept a lot of people alive when maybe that was not their wish. I watched a lot of people suffer, and I also thought a lot of people have some pretty poor outcomes, despite that care that was provided for them. Then in family practice, I had the daunting task of often giving the poor diagnosis of, maybe a cancer diagnosis or some other terminal condition, being able to offer some options for end of life care, but certainly not being able to offer medical assistance in dying. So, I watched a lot of people there suffer quite needlessly as well. So when MAID was coming into inception, I knew for sure that this was something I wanted to do simply because of the suffering that I've seen throughout my career so far. And so I knew that if there was something I could do to not have people suffer, then that was my goal.
I really, to be honest, never thought of that. And that, of course, makes so much sense. I can completely understand why you would feel that way. I mean, you more so than most people witnessed that on a day in and day out basis. And that's exactly what I was going to ask you was what led you, to decide to work with the MAID program. But that completely sums it up. And I can understand. Did you have people quite frankly, that asked, or said that they would rather be able to just go on their own terms when they were suffering?
Oh, yes. I mean, the usual term that we hear over and over and over is, you wouldn't let your dog suffer. Why are we suffering? And people have said that to me for years, right? Like, why can't I not do this? Why can I not end my life, kind of thing?
That's
And
great.
so, fortunately, these people were heard. And, because they've been doing medical assistance in dying in Switzerland and Belgium for years, right? And so, the way that MAID kind of came about was, it was actually, our Canadian Charter of Rights was challenged back in 1993 by Sue Rodriguez. And she had ALS, and she went to court to say, I should be able to end my life. She sadly lost the decision. It was a split decision, 4-5. And then there were several cases that came about throughout the years as well. But then it was really Kay Carter back in 2011. She was an elderly lady with spinal stenosis in great amounts of pain and dying as well. And so it was her case that really, took to court. And this is how we kind of came about having C7 back in 2016.
Wow. I find that just amazing and good for her for giving it a voice because, had somebody not stood up, it probably would still be just kind of swept under the rug.
When first came out, um, there were a few caveats to that. Number one is that you had to have a terminal condition, so you must be dying. And MAID was not going to be allowed if the sole underlying cause was mental illness. So those were the two caveats in the beginning when MAID first came available under C14. But then there were some people who said, well, no, hang on. We're not dying. We don't have a terminal condition, but we're suffering incredibly.
Mm-hmm.
And so why can't I access MAID? And, there were several examples of people who had post-polio syndrome or, a fibromyalgia, chronic pain, these types of people whose lives were just incredibly affected by their disease, but they weren't terminal. And so, again, the courts were challenged, and C7 grew out of that. And what that said now is that we have two tracks for MAID. Track one is where people have a reasonably foreseeable death. So these are people with pancreatic, colon cancers, those types of things that have, made life pretty miserable. And then we have track two, which is where people they do not have a reasonably foreseeable death, but they are still meeting criteria for MAID in every other way. And we'll get into the criteria for MAID now in a little bit. And so those are the two tracks for MAID. So now people who are not dying can access MAID if they meet criteria.
And is that something that they can predetermine? Like say, I know Quebec recently decided that they would allow people in some circumstances to say, I'm sound of mind right now, but if my disease process gets, here, this might be when I want MAID. Am I understanding that correctly? Number one. And number two, is that sort of happening here as well yet in Nova Scotia?
Okay, so there's two parts to that. So the first part is what Quebec has brought in just most recently is what's called MAID as an advance directive. And so when we think about what an advance directive means, it means basically, if I get this or if I get that, I want this for care. So let me give you an example. So there are some people who will say, okay, if I stroke, I do not, I'm so sorry because I know we're picking up that noise from my computer.
Not a problem.
Okay. So if I should stroke, I don't want to be tube fed, right? People can choose that. That's an advance directive. Or if, let's say, for example, they have a heart condition or lung condition, and they say, you know what, if this gets any worse, I do not want CPR. I don't want to be put on life support. So these are advance directives. These are, if this happens, I want or I don't want this. So up until this point, that is not a legal option when it comes to MAID. Okay, you can't say, if I stroke, I want MAID, right? It's not legal. So what Quebec has done, and they've been out front of MAID ever since it, even came about. And so what they've said is, okay, we will do an advance directive for MAID. However, it's not such that it's a forward request. The law still states in Quebec that you must already be suffering from your condition before you can go ahead and put an advance directive for MAID. Okay. So what do I mean by that? So a lot of people always worry about dementia, right? If I develop dementia, I don't want this or I don't want that. And so we've never really been able to say, I want or I don't want MAID. So right now in Quebec, if you've been diagnosed with a mild dementia and you still have the capacity to make decisions for yourself, then you can do an advance directive for MAID, which says, if I can't recognize my family, if I can't stay at home and I need nursing home care, if I don't know how to feed myself anymore, then I want MAID. But you must still have the underlying condition now, right? So you can't say, if I develop dementia, it's when my dementia gets worse.
Right.
Okay, so I think this will come to fruition in the rest of Canada. It's just we're not there yet.
That's right. Because I've often wondered that from an outside perspective that, my goodness, these people that are suffering, but they have to be in their right mind still to make that decision. And yet if their disease process isn't quite at the end stage, so that kind of fills in that gap of people in that situation.
So this is a really nice segue into how do you qualify for MAID?
Yes.
Right? Because you must be capable. So let's go from the top. So first off, you have to be over 18. No ifs, ands, or buts about that. You must be making this decision of your own free will. So if there is any sense that there's any coercion from family, friends, or whomever, it is not okay. You must be capable of making an informed decision. And so capable meaning, there are different facets to capability. And so there are some people who can still absolutely make their decisions around medical decisions, but maybe I wouldn't trust them to balance my bankroll, So there are many different aspects to capability. And so it's the assessor's job, and everyone has to have two independent MAID assessors. And so it's the assessor's job to go in and decide if the person is capable. One of the ideas is that everyone is deemed capable until they're proven that they don't, right? So it is really deemed to be our job as assessors to kind of flush out that capability. But everyone must be competent in order to make medical decisions. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that if you have a dementia that you don't qualify, because maybe you still can make decisions around medical affairs. Sure. And so if you can, then you can still access MAID despite your diagnosis of a dementia. And then you must also be able to make an informed choice. And so when we think about end-of-life care, there are many options for end-of-life care. We look to our palliative care teams and our hospices for their support. There have been some rocky relationships between, palliative care and MAID in the past. I am so thrilled to tell you that, here in Nova Scotia, we have traditionally really worked well together. And that is, really quite beneficial for the patient, which is, of course, the ultimate reason why we're all here. And so, I like to inform people that palliative care can help them with symptom control and, other facets of their life in order to make it manageable to get to the end of their natural life. They can receive care in hospice or hospital if that's desired at the end of their life. And one of the other things now that we just get to be able to offer is that end-of-life choice of MAID. Now, is MAID suitable to bring up to everyone at every point in time? Of course, the answer is no. If I were to give someone a diagnosis of a terminal cancer, I wouldn't all of a sudden say, oh, and you can have MAID. That's not okay, right? It's in turn when you bring up the idea of MAID. Now, some patients will bring it up to us. as a group with Canada, we've done a recent guideline around bringing out MAID. And what we've decided as an organization is that the only people that should really be bringing up MAID as a possible care option are nurse practitioners and physicians, right? The two groups that can make the referral and or answer the questions appropriately. Now, that doesn't mean,
yes.
Sorry, that
I was
doesn't
just
mean
going
that
to say,
other healthcare disciplines can't talk about it.
yes.
Right? Absolutely can. Anyone can talk about it. It's just that maybe to bring it up as a care option, we leave that to the people who can actually A, make the referrals, B, do the assessments.
Yes, and you answered one of my questions. I was going to say there must have to be a referral from a physician or a nurse practitioner like yourself. Yes, okay.
Like I said, over 18 must be making the request voluntarily, have capacity to make the request, having an informed consent, so be informed around your choices. And then you must have a very serious illness, disease, or disability that we can't fix. You must be in a state of irreversible decline. The situation must be grievous and irremediable. So basically very, very serious and can't change it, can't fix it. And then after the irreversible decline, you must be suffering. Now, it is not up to me as a MAID assessor to decide if you're suffering or not, right? The law does not have any parameters around the quantitativeness of suffering.
Right.
People will have physical suffering, of course, pain, nausea, those types of things. But there's also psychological suffering. You know, there's that existential suffering around, oh my gosh, like I've been diagnosed with this terminal illness. It's going to take my life. What is this going to look like? How long am I going to have to do this for? What kind of burden am I going to place on my family? You know, it's incredible the emotions that come with such a diagnosis.
Yeah.
And so, you know, oftentimes people think that suffering is just purely physical, and it's not. The emotional suffering is incredible as well.
I would think it would be torturous, your emotions and your mental state at times. I'm sure it is.
You know, there are a lot of people that will tell me that when they get diagnosed with a terminal condition, they spend days just in a little fog because they're not sure how to make plans or where to go or how to navigate this. You know, and so fortunately, I mean, we have a lot of people who can help, which is great, you know, and so I think it just takes a little bit of time for the information to absorb, and then we can make a plan.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, and oftentimes, right, when we think about MAID and, you know, when people ask for MAID based on, let's just say a terminal cancer, like a pancreatic cancer, I go out and I see people. And so everyone must meet criteria, but there are different reasons why people are asking for MAID. Like there are some people who maybe haven't gotten to the point where they are in terrible amounts of pain, but you know, maybe they're not able to spend time with their family because they're so tired or they're so fatigued. Or, you know, maybe they can't wash themselves anymore. They can't take care of themselves. They can't do those activities of daily living, like get groceries, cook a meal, even want to eat a meal, you know? And so, and sometimes it comes down to, you know, your dignity, because maybe you can't make it to the bathroom, or maybe, you know, you just don't have the physical strength to get to a bathroom. And so then, you know, that dignity of having someone perhaps clean you or dress you or those types of things, right? And those are the reasons why people are asking for MAID. It's not just about pain. It's about the change in their life, the quality of their life.
Good point. Yeah, absolutely. Wow.
Yeah, it's deep.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredible.
Yeah,
You know,
and I don't
because
think people like me don't realize all of those aspects.
And, as a maid assessor, I get invited into people's lives at probably their most vulnerable, the most intimate discussions that people will ever have. I consider it a privilege to be involved. And we can talk a little bit more about that. So, oh, and sorry, you know what? I missed one of the criteria. Let me back up a little bit. The other thing is that you must have a Canadian healthcare card.
Right.
And
Yes.
so we mentioned Switzerland, Belgium, and so they allow people from other countries to come into their country to access medical assistance in dying for a fee, right? Here, when the law was being developed, there were a lot of conversation around, are we going to offer this to people from other countries? And the answer was no. You must have a Canadian healthcare card or be eligible for one in order to access MAID.
Okay.
So
Yes.
I missed that criteria. My apologies.
Not at all.
So yeah, so maybe we kind of talked about, what led me to this and kind of what keeps me there. You know, in the beginning, when I started thinking about MAID, I mean, I've spent many a night or a day in ICU providing people with palliative medications so that they didn't suffer at the end of their life. But I never actually ended a life. And so, I think when you first become a new provider with MAID, you have to be ready to kind of do a lot of introspection and a lot of soul searching after your first provision, because you have to come to terms with what it is that you're doing. And so for me, right, when I get invited into people's lives, and I told you I do believe it is a privilege. But what I consider myself to do is a form of help when there's no other help to be had. Because if someone could fix this cancer, if someone could offer a cure, then surely you would do that. And so I get involved when there is no cure. And there are not great options for the end of life. So when I go and I end someone's life, I think it's a form of help.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to suffer.
Yeah.
We don't need to suffer anymore.
I'm getting emotional right now and I don't know why. I'm looking at what you do as just absolutely a beautiful gift to people. And in a way, it's giving them the power to make that decision and to plan that final moment. I wasn't expecting this. I'm getting very emotional. I I've always had great respect for you, as you know, because I've dealt with you, of course, from the funeral home aspect and when the time does come for somebody, and I've always admired you and was looking so forward to this because I think what you do is incredible, and I think you're an amazing person to be able to do this because I'm a funeral director and I'm getting emotional about this.
Well, and this is the thing, right? It's incredible to be involved in this. And what I feel is that MAID gives people back choice,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yes.
it's choice and control. Because, and again, I keep going back to cancer, but it can be ALS, it can be end stage heart failure, it can be pretty much anything. It takes choice and control away from
Yeah.
people, right? You don't get to choose, you don't get control over this.
That's right.
And
And
so
the
the
dignity, like,
option of MAID,
yes.
right? The option of MAID gives you control and choice back. There are some people that will get qualified for MAID and they never use it. And
Right.
that's perfectly fine. But what they do have is choice. They
Yes.
have the option to use it later if things get too rough. And for some folks, that just gives them such peace of mind that then they can continue on because
Yes.
they know they have options.
I've heard a few families that had MAID set up and they ended up passing right before, just naturally. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well. May have just been that last piece that they had in place and gave them the piece to pass on, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. For
Yeah,
sure.
amazing.
And, it may sound very odd, but when I show up to someone's home or hospital or, residential care or wherever I'm going for MAID, the person themselves are so happy to see me. The rest of the family, maybe not quite so happy, right?
No,
Because they know that their time is very limited,
that's right.
once I arrive. But the person themselves, they're like, oh, I'm so happy that you're here. It's almost like this big sigh of relief because there are some folks, and people will vary, right? There are some folks who are so excited to see what's next, right? There's a lot of times, right, that people will say to me, what do you think is next? What do you think is going to happen to me when I die? And I said, well, I have my own thoughts, but what do you think is going to happen? And so there are some folks who are just so excited because they think they're going to see their loved ones again. They're going to see their mom. They're going to see their dog, you know? And some people are so excited. And then others are just kind of like, oh, okay, she's here. This is going to happen. Right. And so it's this relief. And then they're like, I'm very much at peace with this. I'm very ready. And then, of course, there are some folks I show up and they're like, very, very anxious. They're just still not sure what's coming or what's beyond. And then there are other folks who just believe that this truly is the end and that there is nothing beyond this life and that they're just going to get a chance to go out of this world by their own choice. So it's really, very different for every single person that I see. I always choose to remember something about the person for myself because that gives me closure. So just because I do this every day doesn't mean every MAID death is the same because it's not. It's very much individual. It's very much a person's choice because they also get to choose who's, you know, there are oftentimes people will say, well, this is the next best thing to dying in your sleep. But if you die in your sleep, you don't get a chance to say goodbye.
No.
And maybe you don't get a choice to figure out what this looks like or how it ends because I've had people who will want to have special music playing when they pass away. There are some people who want some candles. There are some people who want clergy with them. There are some people who would like to have like a glass of wine with their family before they go. And then we have some people who just want to run with hope and a smile before they go. It's really very individual, right? And so not one of my MAID deaths is the same as another.
Yeah. And that was another thing I was going to ask you, of course. There's obviously certain religions out there that have their belief system about MAID. Do you have families that bump into that and have a hard time making that decision and are maybe not being supported by their church family, perhaps?
Yeah, for sure. In the beginning, MAID was again very kind of quiet, right? And
Yeah.
I've traveled around this province doing MAID, and so when I would go to very rural, on the cove kind of thing, people were very quiet. They often would ask me like, is there like any identifying marks on your car, like when you show up, right?
Yes.
Or because they didn't want members of their community to even know I was there to do an assessment, let alone to do a provision. And so I always arrive very much nothing on my car, nothing on me, nothing is a telltale sign. And in the first few years, actually up until January of this past year, we were having to put MAID on the death certificate here in Nova Scotia. And so I felt very strongly that this was an invasion of people's privacy, right? Because there were actually some folks who, when they found out that MAID had to go on their death certificate, refused. to have MAID because they thought in one way or another, someone was going to find out that they had medically assisted death. Now, as you well know, what I provide at the time of death is a death certificate. What funeral homes provide are certificates of death, which have a date on it, but not a cause of death.
That's right.
But still, people were so worried that someone was going to find out that they had MAID. So, along with my team, we spent almost 3 years in conversations with vital statistics, trying to get MAID off of our death certificates, and finally we did.
That is
So
so interesting. I've noticed that working at the funeral home that if I know that somebody has gone under with MAID, I've noticed that shift that it now says the disease, not the MAID process. So wow, that's fascinating. I did not realize that. Good for you.
Absolutely. We lobbied very hard for this change because every MAID death in Canada gets logged under a federal reporting system. So it's not as if though the data is not being captured. It is. And if we as a province want to pull our data from that federal data, we can. So there's no need to be doing this in the province, making MAID be on a death certificate. So now what's listed as the cause of death is the actual reason why the person was seeking MAID.
Wow.
So getting back to religion, so, you know, there are a lot of faiths that support MAID. Most notably, Anglican and United are very open and very liberal towards MAID. The times that I've been invited into churches to speak, it's been with those two religions. Mm. And I will tell you, I do go to churches to speak, and I, you know, talk about MAID to congregations. People are asking about it. People are, you know, curious. I'm not, and I don't expect to be invited into a Catholic church to talk about MAID. For sure, right? That's the religion that most often is opposed to medically assisted.
Yeah. Hopefully that will change. We seem to have a better pope these days, but I know it's still a bone of contention for them for sure, unfortunately.
And that's not to say that people of the Catholic faith don't have MAID, because
exactly.
They do.
That's right.
They do.
That's right.
Right, they do. And again, it just goes back to choice, right? It's around about making an individual personal choice, hoping to be supported by their church, their clergy, you know. And, you know, there are some people who will have a medically assisted death who are, for lack of better terms, hoping to get to heaven, right? Because they're not quite sure if what they're doing is going to be okay, you know, within the eyes of their religion. But then some people's suffering is just too great to stay here and go through it. And they would rather maybe suffer consequences of the afterlife than, you know, to be in this life and to be suffering.
That says a lot about what the suffering process must be like. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. Absolutely. So, you know, there's a lot of folks out there who maybe wonder what a MAID death looks like and those types of things, because there is a lot of rhetoric out there. And there are a lot of opponents to MAID who have been talking around the horribleness or, you know, the suffering that happens during a MAID death. And I can't tell you that is so far from the truth, right? So everyone has a right to change their mind right up to the last second. You know, when I arrive at someone's home or hospital or hospice or wherever I am, the first thing I say to them is, are you sure? And not trying to change their mind, but they have every right to change their mind. And it doesn't matter that we're all gathered. It doesn't matter that I've come. You still could change your mind. And if people say, no, I'm ready, then I do my own IVs. So I put 2 IVs in. If someone's coming that don't do IVs, usually they'll send in the VON nurses ahead of time and they will start the IVs for them.
Mhm.
I can then give people as much time as they need to say goodbye. It might look like 2 minutes because they've already said their goodbyes. It might look like 20 minutes or 2 hours. Whatever it is, that's okay. And then when they are ready, the first medication I give puts people to sleep. And people are usually asleep in under a minute. A lot of people will fall asleep talking. A lot of people fall asleep laughing. There was one gentleman, he was in his late 80s, and he had family all gathered around. His wife was on one side, I was on the other side. As he was starting to get sleepy, he looked over at me and he said, "I think you have to be the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life." And then he went to sleep, and his wife was like, "What?" But bless him, he just fell asleep, just talking like that. And then there was, another gentleman who had like a rectal cancer, and as he fell asleep, he goes, "No more pain in my," you know. And then there are other people that will just fall asleep laughing because, family or someone had said something funny.
Yeah.
There are some people who will fall asleep crying. There are some people who just look at their family gathered around them as they die. There are others who just close their eyes. But that first medication puts you to sleep, and it's very quick. And then the next medication puts you deeper in a coma. A lot of people may snore during that time. And that's just very short-lived. And then the last medication that we give stops your breathing, which then in turn stops your heart. And from the time that I get started until the time someone passes away, it's usually about 5 minutes. Not much longer.
Very peaceful.
It is incredibly peaceful. It is calm. It's quiet. And there's no suffering. And I will share with you that my father had MAID. I've been on the other side of this too. My dad had MAID in February of 23. And if I thought for 1 second that there was any suffering or anything about a medically assisted death that was not calm and peaceful, my father would have never done it.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Amazing. I'm blown away by your experiences. And I have to say too that as the funeral director, meeting with these families following the deaths, I've never had a family not speak incredibly highly about the experience and how beautiful it was and how peaceful it was and how it was the nicest thing that they could have decided as a family. And, I've never had a family say that it wasn't the best decision. Hands down.
Yeah. And I think why MAID has gained such popularity, and I hate to call it popularity, but truly it has become more accessible as an option as well, is because, there are people there are a lot of people now who have witnessed a MAID death, whether, it's your family or your friends and so because people are seeing that it is such a calm and peaceful way to pass on, and your choice at that, that's why this now has become more asked about, more talked about, and not quite the taboo that it was back in 2016 when we started doing this.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think I'd like to bring up at this point, if it's okay with you, is that in 2021, when C7 came into effect, which is where you no longer had to have a terminal illness in order to access MAID, we also got then, through the law, what was called a waiver of final consent. And so maybe your listeners may be familiar with the story of Audrey Parker. And so Audrey was a 50-odd-year-old lady out of Halifax who had metastatic breast cancer. It was in all of her bones, and it went to her brain. And she had 2 assessments. I was fortunate enough to be one of her assessors because she was a lovely, lovely woman. And she wanted to see another Christmas, but it was kind of coming into August, September. And she called me up and she goes, I see things going across the ceiling. She said, but I know they're not there. She said, what happens if you come to my home and I can't tell you to go ahead and end my life? Now, this was in 2018. I said to her, I have to walk away. She said, what do you mean? And I said, well, unless you can tell me on the day that you're okay with me ending your life, and that's what you want me to do, then I can't do it. That's the law. She said, well, that is completely and totally unacceptable. And that woman was a force to be reckoned with. And so she went to every government building she could get into, every podcast she could get onto, every medical, office she could get into, to say, this is not right. The law needs to change. I've had my 2 assessments. My consent form is signed. I should be able to have this, even if I can't tell them. Audrey ended up dying early. She did not make it to Christmas because she was afraid she was going to lose her choice. And so we had in the law in 2021 what's known as Audrey's Amendment, and it is federal, that the person now, while they are still competent, can make a waiver of final consent. And what that waiver says is that I, as your provider, can go ahead and end your life on that day, even if you can't tell me to do so. So what it does is it allows me to have conversations with patients ahead of time around what is acceptable at the end of life and what is not. And if we get to a point where life is not acceptable anymore, but you can't tell me, maybe it's because you're on escalating doses of narcotics, or maybe it's because your disease has taken away your ability to communicate. Because we've had those conversations and because you made the decision when you were competent, then I can go ahead and help you end your life on the day, even if you can't tell me to do so.
Right. Yes.
And that's our waiver of final consent.
Wow. And I do remember Audrey's story.
Yes.
Yes, I
certainly. A lot of people with dementia are very, very much comforted by the fact that we can do this waiver of final consent. Because if they lose who they are, we still have the waiver.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all things I've thought about so many times with the MAID process. And you're answering all of my questions, of course. Wow. Yeah. And I'm so, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you.
I was just going to say, I'm so close, to you in our fields, and there's still so much that I didn't realize about it. So I can just imagine everybody else out there, yeah, I didn't realize that all these choices, were there and in place. And I have to admit too, that I had preconceived notions myself years ago about it. Probably due to the fact that I do have a Catholic background, and so it's not that I thought it was right or wrong. It was nothing about that. It was just all these, but what about this? And what about that? But until the truth is, until one of us, until we're there ourselves, I don't think anybody can tell anybody else when enough is enough.
That's right.
That's all there is to it for me. Yes.
It really is. It really is. And again, I think it really just comes back to choice.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we briefly touched on before that I want to circle back to is kind of around the process, right? Because people are like, okay, well, fine, she's kind of told us what this looks like, but how do we get there?
Yeah.
And so ideally what happens is a referral comes into, and I'm speaking truly just about the Nova Scotia system. This does vary across our country. The criteria for MAID does not vary. how you access MAID potentially can vary, because there are some provinces where we have a coordination center, like we do here in Nova Scotia. And then there are other provinces that do not have a coordination center. And maybe it's just done by individual referrals type thing. But here in Nova Scotia, what happens is either a nurse practitioner or a physician will send in a referral to our program. And so that comes to our central office in Halifax. Now, some people may say, well, hang on, I don't have a nurse practitioner or a physician. How do I access this? And so what I oftentimes will tell those people is that you make a phone call to our MAID office in Halifax and have a conversation with one of our navigators, right? To deem if, are you actually looking for assessments or are you just looking for information? But ideally, then a referral would come from a provider. And the nurse navigators then reach out to the people and they do what's called an intake assessment. And so they really go through all the things around why you're asking for MAID. They do kind of a safety assessment on our part so that we know what we're walking into when we go into communities, right? Because we know they're not controlled environments. So they'll do a bit of a safety assessment so that we know where we're going. And then they set up for the two assessors to go out. So usually a first assessor is assigned, and then that assessor goes into the home or wherever the person they're meeting at, and they decide if the person is eligible for MAID or not. They also usually decide if the person is track 1 or track 2, right? So reasonably foreseeable death versus not reasonably foreseeable. And then they also get a consent form done. Now, the consent form is the only MAID document that needs to be witnessed. And so the witness has to be over 18. They either have to know the person personally or see proof of their identity. And they cannot in any way, shape, or form benefit from the death of that person. So we usually say we don't choose family members as witnesses. And sometimes this can get a little bit dicey, especially when people want their privacy. But we can always arrange for a person to come in to act as the witness. It's just that the patient cannot sign their consent form unless the witness is in front of them, because truly that's the only thing that the witness is signing for, is that the person signed it in their presence. So once that's done, the second assessment is usually completed. And the second assessment is not a second assessment by me, like by the same person. We have to have 2 people. Right, so 2 nurse practitioners, 2 physicians, or 1 of each need to see the person, because, it's a safeguard around MAID such that 2 people must find the person eligible. Right? So that is not just the opinion of 1 person. So then if the person is track 1, which means death is reasonably foreseeable, they have their 2 assessments completed and their consent form is signed. They do have the option of doing a waiver of final consent, such that if they lose their ability to make those decisions. But also, too, those people on track 1 can make a date for MAID whenever they're ready. There's no waiting period for track 1. When the law first came out in 2016, there was a 10-day wait period, but there is no longer a wait period. If you're deemed to be on track 2, which is not reasonably foreseeable death, there is a 90-day wait period for those folks. And it's really meant as a reflection period to make sure that this is indeed what they want to do. Because remember, these folks do not have a reasonably foreseeable death. They've decided the quality of their life is not good, but their death is not foreseeable. So we just want to always make sure, and this is a safeguard around making sure that the person is not making a very quick decision based on a certain diagnosis. It also gives us time, because being on track 2, one of the assessors must have expertise in the condition for which the person is asking for MAID. So for example, if someone is asking for MAID based on chronic pain, we must have a pain specialist or someone with expertise in pain weigh in on the fact of what we call irremediability, so not being able to fix it.
Right.
So, of course, we know that takes time. So that's why these folks must also be waiting out the 90-day period. Oftentimes it takes even longer than 90 days.
Yeah.
So, but that's the minimum for track 2 folks.
It's very thorough, it sounds like. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like I said before, there are some people who will choose to get qualified for MAID, and it's an option. They never choose to use it. There are other folks who will want to set a date right away for MAID, and then there are other folks who kind of tuck it in their back pocket and know that it's there and will choose a date at a later time. There are some folks who are just suffering incredibly. And so if I'm the second assessor, and we know ahead of time that people are just so at the end of their life and they just can't do it any longer, there have been times that I've gone out and I've done an assessment, done the provision directly after.
Wow.
So there are some people who get fully qualified for MAID and have their life end within an hour.
Wow. I would assume that's got to be tough because yeah, they just want it expedited, it sounds like.
This and oftentimes this happens when people get referred to the program too late
Yeah.
in their trajectory of their illness, or things have taken a turn very, very quickly.
Wow.
Right. And this does not happen often.
No.
And we also have to remember that it probably looks very different across the country. Because, for example, in Manitoba, they always go to MAID as a team. They have like an IV nurse. They probably have, I believe they also take a social worker with them, and then they take the provider with them. And there are 3 people that go to every provision as a team.
Wow.
Here in Nova Scotia, we go by ourselves.
Wow.
Right? We do not go as a team. Sometimes if the physicians need the VON to start IV line, it's truly just me.
Wow.
And so if it's just me, then I kind of can choose. And, for me, MAID is not a Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 kind of job. There are sometimes I get calls, that people are just suffering incredibly, or they've had that change in their condition very quickly. And how soon can I go?
When somebody pre-plans their MAID, do some people pick certain dates based on certain things, or is it, I'm sure it's all over the place, or is it random sometimes for people? Is it a time frame? You must see it all.
Right, it's different for every person.
Yeah.
And there are some people who kind of sit with a calendar and they'll say, okay, well, this one's birthday is here and that's their anniversary, and so I don't want to do it around those because I don't want it associated. And so maybe I'll pick like 3 weeks from then. Or then other people will say, you know what, I've always wanted to think about dying on my birthday. And so there are some people who will plan around that. There are some people, of course, who plan around the holidays. And so November and January are incredibly, incredibly busy months for me. Here in Nova Scotia, it is incredible. Because what happens is people will want to pass away in November because it gives their families a little bit of time to grieve before Christmas comes.
Yes. Yeah.
And then there are other folks who say, well, you know what, I'm going to make it through Christmas because then my family doesn't have to associate my death with Christmas. And so they make it into January, and then they say, okay, how soon can you come?
Wow. Yeah. I never thought of that either, but very true. Yes. Wow.
There are some folks who are just so sick, they're like, it doesn't matter, Erica, when can you come?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can imagine that. Wow. Wow. I'm just blown away by what you do, Erica. I really am. I just think you are such a strong, strong person to be able to do this because I don't know. I don't know how I would feel, to be honest, giving somebody an injection, although I feel like it's an absolute blessing and it's an absolute gift that you're giving to people. I don't know if I could do it. Honestly.
Yeah,
and I don't know why.
There's a lot of us that can't do it, right? I mean, just because you're a nurse practitioner or physician doesn't mean you do this work, because maybe you can't process that work,
Yeah.
right? And, there are some folks who just want to be assessors, but they want no part of the provision, right? And they're okay to do that. And, this is a really great time for me to bring up around a conscientious objector. And so, even though we're healthcare providers, we are not compelled to do this work. We have every right to say, no, I don't want to be involved. Now, as a nurse practitioner or physician, if a patient comes into our office and says, I'd like to talk about MAID, we can say, I kind of don't agree, or I don't want to talk about that. Or if someone comes in and says, I would like a referral to the MAID program, we don't get to say sorry, right? We can say, me personally, I don't agree with that, but I will refer you on to someone who can give you the answers. I will refer you on to the program so that then they can decide how this moves forward. So while no healthcare provider can be compelled to be involved, we do have an ethical obligation to patients to make sure that they receive the care they're requesting. Okay, so everyone has a right not to be involved. I feel, again, I keep going back to the word privilege to do this work and to be able to do it. Right. I'm okay with this work. Now that doesn't mean that, at some provisions, the tears are rolling down my face too. Right. And I don't often, like or want to cry for sure. But there are some people that I follow along for maybe a couple of years, and I develop a relationship with these folks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I feel that loss as well. And I'm very much a pet person. And so if there are pets, like if there are dogs on the bed, it gets me every time.
Me too. I know. I know. I'm the same way. I'm the very
Yeah.
same way. Wow. You have a gift. You've been given a gift yourself to be able to do this for people. Honestly, it's really mind-blowing to me. Um, and I know there was conversation around, and there probably still is, about funeral homes potentially having a special place or a room for clients, patients, families that may choose, I guess, if they don't want to be in a hospital and they don't necessarily want to be at home, that could be sort of a third choice. And I know a couple of funeral homes in Nova Scotia have done that. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that's something that a lot of funeral homes should maybe consider a bit more?
I think they all should consider it, right? Because what I find, is that, and oftentimes, it's maybe a couple that's not necessarily elderly, but this is what I'm running across more often. And, if one partner is dying and the other partner is going to still remain living in the home, right? Then oftentimes they're like, I don't want to die at home because I don't want her to have to look every time she looks at the couch, she sees that I was there.
Yes.
Or, you know, I don't want to die in my bed because she's got to sleep there, kind of thing. And so we often will see that. A lot of people think, okay, well, we'll just go to hospital and get this done. And we hospitals have been incredibly accommodating to us, but it's a more sterile environment. We often will go into like outpatient settings in the hospital after hours to access a bed for MAID. So it's not like you're in a hospital room surrounded by everyone, kind of thing. Because we know what the state of healthcare is. Oftentimes people are in emerge for 3 or 4 days waiting for a bed. So we can't go in there and just take over a bed for MAID. We can't do that. So, there becomes a lot of hidden parts with trying to get to hospital for MAID. So having the funeral homes offer a safe, quiet, peaceful place for us to go, it's incredible. And I've done many, maids in funeral homes now, and there's not been one where it's been anything but a beautiful experience. There are some people, when I give them the option of thinking about going to a funeral home for me, they like when I mention it, they're like, "What?" They think it's the most craziest thing that I could possibly say. But once I start telling them, this could be an option because it's quiet and people can gather and you can have as many family there as you want, and you know, uh,
You could even
and
have
sometimes people will say, "Oh, well, I wonder if I'll get a discount if I have it done there. Then you don't have to come and pick me up."
exactly. They could even have a service with themselves present.
Absolutely.
Like my mind is just wow. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't know if maybe part of the reason for some funeral homes not doing it is potentially maybe whoever owns it, maybe the decision is faith driven. I'm not sure, but what I do know is that if funeral homes would offer this, it would be a huge, huge asset to the folks I'm seeing, because again, it gives them choice.
Yeah.
This is what it comes back to every time. It's about choice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think personally, just from talk with my fellow colleagues, I think it's the stigma attached. Like, oh, we don't want to be, the place that allows that to happen, and talking to you, it couldn't be further from the truth, surrounding helping people and being, it's a natural link, from of course passing away to the funeral home. I hope that this may open people's eyes a bit, Erica. Like I just think that that's a natural move. It's yeah,
It really is. It really is.
it's
And
a missed opportunity, really.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Wow. And I know we briefly spoke about this, but mental illness is a form, it's a disease. It's a disease. And currently, can you talk a little bit about that and who would qualify and what you would have to really look into to have somebody qualify for MAID?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of attention towards MAID for mental illness. And basically, right now, if your sole condition is mental illness, you cannot access MAID. It was due to be brought into assent in March of 23. There was a stay put on that because the provinces were not quite ready. In 2024, again, weren't ready. Now, we here in Nova Scotia with our MAID program, we were way out in front. We were in front of the rest of the country, and we were ready for MAID for mental illness. But because a lot of other provinces and territories were not, then the government said, "I'm sorry, if you're not ready, we can't do this." So MAID as the underlying condition, or sorry, mental illness as the underlying condition for MAID is not allowed. It is illegal. Now, that's not to say that if someone has a cancer, just because they have a past history of mental illness, so anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, it doesn't rule them out, because their request for MAID is not based on their mental illness, it's based on their cancer.
Right.
So we can still go ahead and do MAID as long as they have that decision-making capability and their mental illness is not impairing that.
Yes.
So right now the government has tabled MAID for mental illness until at least March of 2027. It will depend on who's in government at that point in time to decide if we move forward with reevaluating MAID for mental illness again or not. So right now, no MAID for mental illness. It is considered illegal if that is the sole underlying reason.
Yeah. And I suppose for now that kind of does make sense. Sort of. I know it's a hard area to Yeah,
So it's an illness. It's just like
it
any
certainly
other disease
is.
that we have, right? There's a lot of stigma around mental health, and there shouldn't be, right? It is a organic illness, just like cancer or congestive heart failure or COPD.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we here in Nova Scotia had decided upon was that in order for someone to be eligible for MAID, obviously they still had to meet the same criteria that's outlined by the law, but at least one of the two assessors must be a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And the reason we kind of outlined that very clearly was because, you know, a lot of us as NPs or physicians, we don't have some of the expertise around every single condition that's out there. And so psychiatrists are the ones who are best centered to say, okay, well, this has been tried and this is tried and this is tried, and we don't have any options left. So we meet the criteria around irremediable, right? Which is we can't fix this. But I'll be honest with you, I don't have that expertise. I can't say for sure that there's not some type of, you know, treatment out there that I don't know about that may benefit a person.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so that's why we felt it very, very much needed to have that expertise piece around being able to say, yes, you know, this person is irremediable. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean that the person has to have gone to the far ends of the earth, scoping out absolutely every single treatment that there is. It must be, though, that the person has given reasonable thought to treatments. And if they've declined those treatments, we have to know that they've made that decision with sound judgment and the reasons why they've declined treatment. Or if there's a treatment that's available, I don't know, in China,
Mm-hmm.
but our person has no financial means or maybe physical means in order to get there, then it's not an available option, right? But we needed the expertise around knowing all of this in order to say if the person was deemed eligible or not. So again, a lot of provinces are, you know, their wait lists for psychiatry are huge as it is, even not taking into account the MAID. So the even availability of services here in our own country, right, was something that we had to think about in order to be ready to offer MAID for mental illness.
Yeah, that makes sense. And not surprisingly, obviously everything has been very thought out. It's a process. Yeah. Wow. A
That's
lot more
right.
to it. There's a lot more to it.
Well, and there's a lot more behind the scenes, right? I sit on several advisory boards that are federal. There's a provincial and territorial advisory committee. We also have Dying with Dignity Canada. They are incredible, and their support for families and people are just amazing. And so I sit on their advisory board as well. We have a Nova Scotia advisory board. We, as CanMAP, so again, Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, we are members, but then we also have individual working groups on outlining best practices, making sure that, you know, those best practice guidelines are disseminated out to assessors and providers. And then we've most recently developed a Canadian MAID curriculum project. So then now there are 7 modules combined of online learning with some didactic training and then we're doing facilitated Zoom sessions where we can access everyone across the country and we can kind of teach them how to do MAID well, right? And so we've been incredibly blessed by Health Canada to get the funding to do this, because prior to this there was not really any kind of, this is how you do MAID. It was kind of almost as if you went with someone to see one and then you did one and then you taught one kind of thing. It was old school kind of how MAID kind of came about, and how we became experts was just by learning, you know, from others. But now there's a national curriculum where, you know, we're teaching people how to do this right.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Erica, I cannot thank you enough for taking part in Death Talk Canada today. I was so excited for this episode, and a wealth of information from you, from a great, smart, and strong woman that you are. I appreciate it so much. And it To me, it truly is a gift that you give. It really is. It's nothing but.
Well, I want to thank you for having me because I think conversations like this are so important, right? Because it lets people understand what MAID is. And, you know, when you have a sit down face to face conversation about it and take all of the politics out of it, this is what you get.